All right, so I'm going to start by challenging you a little bit by asking you to go all the way back in your minds to the story that Shannon so lovingly read for us at the beginning. And I want to start with a question and ask, how do you feel about miracles? How do you feel about miracles? Do they fill you with awe and wonder? Or do you look at them with a little bit of a side eye? Did that really happen? Maybe Tabitha wasn't really dead. Maybe they didn't have doctors back then. She could have just been in a coma. I don't know if you're anything like me, but even talking about miracles kind of bothers me sometimes because it leaves me wondering, what does it mean for me? What does it mean for us in our relationship with God if that woman just miraculously stopped bleeding because she wanted it? Or that man believed so hard that his daughter just miraculously recovered? Or Tabitha was lost to her friends and her community, but she was raised from the dead and they got to have her again. Yet, seemingly all around us, there's tragedy happening all the time, out in the world and in our own lives. And unless you can really keep your faith together, which I have to admit, I definitely cannot always do that, it seems like God can just be mysteriously absent from our tragedy. So why do miracles happen to some and not others? Why Tabitha? We could all use some miracles in our lives right now. And I bet if it really got down to it, we would even negotiate and settle for something far less than resurrection. Maybe just like one really good rainy season. Or maybe a child to come back from college and to have miraculously discovered their vocation and they know exactly what they're going to do with their lives. Or maybe an ailing and suffering parent to no longer have to suffer, whatever that means. I mean, heck, I would settle for a miracle of walking into the Safeway, into the cereal aisle, and seeing buy two, get three free and loading up for the week. And that's not a joke. I love cereal. You can ask anybody. But if we just look at the story that Shannon read for us today, it is really tempting to believe that Tabitha gets to come back from the dead because she is such a good person. I mean, the story is explicit and tells us she was devoted to good works and acts of charity. It is clear by the way that the Widows Act and the community reacts to her death that she was a beloved member of that community. So that must be it, right? Peter brings Tabitha back from the dead because she's earned it. But what would that mean for us in our relationship with God? So we know that can't be it. So why then? Could it be that maybe this story isn't even really about Tabitha? I mean, not really. So when I gathered the folks together for a Bible study earlier this week, I asked the question, how do miracles make you feel? And Brooke Taylor responded with such a beautiful response that I had to ask her if I could use it, and she gave me permission. She responded like any good Episcopalian to that question with another question. And she said, does it even matter if they're real? Aren't miracles meant to point to something, a truth far greater than historical accuracy? What Brooke was saying is that miracles in the Bible are meant to show us something bigger. Maybe it's just to show us the glory of God, or maybe to show that Jesus is indeed the Son of God, or the disciples are indeed the followers of Jesus. So maybe it doesn't matter if the story is true because it points to something bigger. But here's the problem with me for that answer for this story is I don't think this story does a very good job of that. So if you think about it, if it was meant to point to something bigger or draw us into something deeper in that way, wouldn't Peter call on the name of God or on Jesus to make Tabitha whole? Instead of sending people out of the room, wouldn't there be people there, an amazed crowd, to witness the miracle and be in awe? Can you believe that happened? Or wouldn't we get a group of doubters to meet Peter at the door and say, Peter, there's nothing you can do. She's already dead. The whole, the body probably already smells thing that makes it really dramatic. We don't get any of those things here. We get those in almost all of the other miracles, but here we get none of those typical miracle elements. In fact, the way Peter raises Tabitha from the dead is almost comical. You heard Shannon say it. Tabitha, get up. And here's the thing about that. That is even less dramatic than it seems, because when you translate the original Greek, there are lots of ways you could theoretically tell somebody to get up. The 2 times that Jesus takes someone who is dead and asks them to get up, he uses agiero with the widow of Nain's son, and he uses talitha cum with Jairus' daughter. And those we translate as arise. It's much more beautiful and dignified than get up. And here, the original Greek that we translate as get up is anistemi. And anistemi is like the most basic kind of get up you could possibly use. It's like the get up that my wife and I use for our kids in the morning to get them out of bed for school. Get up! Exactly like Shannon read it. And it is a phrase so common that it is used over 100 times in the New Testament alone. It is not very dramatic. So don't you think if this story was meant to establish Jesus as the chosen one, to carry on the mantle of Christ, or to show us that the God we believe in is so powerful that God can overcome any manner of evil, even death, don't you think we would have heard a lot more about the miracle itself, how it happened, how the people reacted, and maybe a little less about the community that it happened in or the person that it happens to? And here's the thing. I think Brooke is right. The story is meant to point to something bigger. This is a bigger story than a regular miracle story. This is a resurrection story. And resurrection doesn't happen that often, even in the Bible. In the New Testament, it happens when Jesus raises the widow of Nain's son and Jairus' daughter. We already talked about that. Jesus also brings back Lazarus. Probably most people are familiar with that. Then we have Tabitha today. A little bit later, Paul raises Eutychus. And then we have the big one, Jesus. We just talked about that a few weeks ago. And that one, that's the big one, because that is the story that all of the other resurrection stories point to. But here's where this story is different for me. It doesn't just point to Jesus to remind us that that happened. The Bible is full of stories that tell us exactly what we should think about Jesus and who Jesus is. Stories of faith. Stories of love. Stories of putting the last first and lifting up the lowly. Stories of resurrection. And here we have a community of widows that has such faith that when their friend dies, they hear this guy, Peter, who's maybe done some pretty important things, who is close by, which, spoiler alert, that's like 15 miles, and they have to walk or run to get there, that they just send for him. And here we have Peter, who is so filled with love that he is doing something in Lydda, and people say, hey, come without delay. And he's like, yeah, sure, I'm not doing anything. Let's go. And here we have a woman in Tabitha who is a widow herself, which if you know anything about biblical times, that's a big deal. That's a hard thing. And yet she is taking care of other widows. Talk about lifting up the lowly and putting the last first. And she dies and is resurrected. So maybe you're thinking, okay, Brad, this is quaint, but this is just your way of interpreting the story. And you know what? You're probably right. But one thing I do know is that the authors of the Bible use language very intentionally when they want to connect people or places or events or themes. And in this story, we have a group of widows that are described as widows that after the miracle, the author of Acts, who is Luke, he calls them saints, meaning they're sanctified now. They're set apart. Nothing happened to them. It happened to Tabitha, yet now they're saints. And here we have Luke tells us that Peter showed Tabitha to be alive. It's like a weird way to say it, right? How do you show somebody to be alive? Like she walks out and you're like, look at her. She is now alive. I showed you. But it's not the first time Luke writes those words. In the very beginning of Acts, chapter 1, verse 3, he writes of Jesus, and then Jesus showed himself to be alive. So Luke is connecting this group in Joppa. Luke is connecting Peter and Tabitha to Jesus. So I'm going to say a thing here, and you just have to stick with me because it's a little bit like, wait, really? But we'll walk it out together. The widows, the folks in Joppa, Peter, Tabitha, they don't just point to Jesus in this story. They are Jesus in this story. So for me, that answers the question of why Luke would write about this miracle, but we're still left wondering, why do miracles happen to some and not others? Why Tabitha and why not us? So I'm not sure if you've heard, and you may not have, so I'll make sure that I fill you in. There are a lot of hard things going on in the world right now. So out there in the world, we have COVID, we have the war in Ukraine, we have politics and election coming up. And even if you can ignore all that, even if you bury yourself under a rock and escape all of that, you still have hard things in your own life. If you're like me, there is work to be done and never enough time to do it. There are family and friends to connect with and not enough emotional energy to really connect like you want. Or maybe because of those other big things, maybe you can't even be in the same space as those people that you want so badly to love. Yet, no matter how hard we try, and we can go about our lives living the best lives we can and following Jesus, and no matter what we do, we're all going to experience tragedy. Hard tragedy. I would be shocked if there are not a bunch of people sitting here today that aren't experiencing tragedy in some form right now. So why do we hear about miracles in the Bible, and we hear about Joppa and Tabitha, and what is that supposed to mean for us and how we think about God, that miracle is not happening for us right now? Why tell us about all of the background around the folks in Joppa? Why tell us about the miracle without giving it any normal miracle elements like the amazed crowd or any of the things we see in the other healing miracles? Why not more drama if this story is about raising someone from the dead? Now, I said that Peter and Tabitha and the widows, they were Jesus figures. But here's the main thing for me. Those folks, they're not that different than us, right? They're living in a world full of war and political upheaval. They are experiencing pain and loss and tragedy. And there is certainly enough sickness to go around to kill them and the people they love. Sound familiar? Yet they hold on to their faith. They do the best with what they have. They serve their neighbors. They use their particular gifts and talents, whether that's running 15 miles to Lydda, whether that's making tunics, whether that's caring for the dead body of their loving friend. They use the gifts and talents they have to be Jesus figures for each other. Joppa does not get to have Tabitha back because they believed hard enough. Peter does not bring Tabitha back from the dead because he is the chosen one to carry on the work of Jesus. And Tabitha is not resurrected because she is the right kind of Christian or because she's such a good person. And this story, for me, it's not even about that resurrection. This story is about a community that when something bad happens, they don't sit around and pray for a miracle. They don't wait to see what God's going to do. They set about the work of being Jesus for each other in that moment right away. So why Tabitha? Why does this community get to have a miracle, and why do miracles happen to some and not others? Why not us? So here's the big disappointment of this sermon. I don't have answers to any of those questions, not really. But this story doesn't have answer to those questions. I would argue that the miracles in the Bible do not answer these questions because, like Brooke said in the Bible study, that's not the point. The point of this story for me is that right here, right now, Jesus is at work in us as we set about the work of being Jesus for each other. Jesus is at work in our lives through every moment, through pandemics and war, through politics and disagreement, through loneliness, through pain, through loss, even in death. You are doing the work of Jesus, being Jesus for one another. When you give somebody a smile or a wink or hold the door or a helping hand or a hug, when you offer words of encouragement, or when you just sit there and be with somebody when they need you to just be with them at that moment. You are being Jesus not because your faith is so great that you could move a mountain. Not because your story is so beautiful and your faith is so deep that your story points directly to Jesus and to God. But you, just like the folks in Joppa, just like Peter, just like Tabitha, you are a Jesus figure because you just open your heart and let the miracles work through you. You strive to be Jesus for one another, no matter what the world looks like around you. And that is enough.